Awesome. We're recording now. Don't laugh.
No,
Okay.
I'm not laughing about
Okay. Okay.
it. Okay, serious.
Okay. Shh. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our first Black History Month podcast episode. Today, we are hearing from a very special guest, and I'll leave it to them to introduce themselves and what they'll be talking about today.
Hi guys, my name is Deterville. I'm 15 from New Orleans and I go to Ben Franklin High School. My pronouns are they, them, and today I'm going to be speaking about the representation of Black people in different facets of the media.
Awesome. So, if you don't know, we are trying to start a new podcast series. So, this is not the last one you're going to be hearing from. So, just keep in touch and in tune with that. But anyway, so Reagan, Black History Month is ending, but fighting for Black lives is not. So, do you have any thoughts before we start on how we in the Asian American community can be better allies? How can we build more of a solidarity? How can we show up more?
I think one of the most important things to consider in that frame is just education, education, education. We know Black History Month is a much needed period of culture appreciation that's often overlooked throughout other times of the year, and one of the only periods where Black history and its people are celebrated, spoken about, and acknowledged widely. So I think that participation within the African American Pacific Islander community is really important during this time. And yeah, stay sexy.
Awesome. So tell us about the issue that you're going to be talking to us about today. Like, what caught your attention? Why did you want to do it? Personal anecdotes.
So today I was really nervous to present, and friend Abigail, my co-host today, suggested I started speaking about something I love, and I decided anime was a perfect segue to an overall larger issue that I wanted to speak about today, which I already mentioned is representation of Black people in the media. So I started watching anime in July of 2020, and it was kind of like a side effect of being super lonely during COVID and having nothing to do because it was like summertime. And as much as I enjoyed it, I found myself feeling kind of guilty for enjoying it because there were no people who looked like me. And I felt sort of like a sellout to my own people because I was becoming so captivated in this media form that seemingly had no room for people who looked like me. And throughout this, I realized the cultural differences in Japanese and American culture and lack of exposure a lot of Japan has had to people that look similar to what I do. And I understand this, and I still felt very similarly for a long time. And over time, I've come to realize I should really have no shame for enjoying anime, and rather the overall implications of racism that are affected the lack of Black people present in the media form are just more worth discussing than my guilt, I guess.
Right. So I've heard a lot of people say that when faced with a lack of representation or accurate representation, a lot of people have said they felt angry about that. But, why do you feel guilt? Like, why guilt, essentially?
Yeah, so I think throughout my life, I've definitely struggled with my racial identity, and especially because I went to private school, I think I subjected myself to a lot of assimilation and kind of just like cultural negligence, I guess. So when I began to enjoy anime and I started watching it and I became like an avid enjoyer of the media form, I think I just felt like I was denying a part of myself. I was denying my race by enjoying something that seemingly had no representation for people who looked like me. So I was kind of ashamed of that. And I think I saw it as another way of rejecting my race, like I had done in my past, by
Mm.
looking at this wide, grandiose form of media that just had little to no representation of people who looked like me or other minorities, I guess.
Right. So essentially, it's guilt on the basis that you felt like you weren't, you know, what's the word for it? Like you weren't guilty for enjoying anime, but rather because anime didn't have the representation that you ought to be
Yeah.
um, supporting. I see. So, I mean, I imagine there is a story behind why there is such a lack of representation in anime, or,
Yeah.
at least a history behind it. So, can you tell us
Yeah.
about that?
So there are definitely Black people in Japanese animation and Japanese comics, not many, and how they are represented varies wildly between artists and by era. And just as the civil rights movement altered American culture, Japanese pop culture has been changing. And just as attitudes differ person by person in the US, the same is true in Japan. So, historically, Japan tried to cut itself off from the Western influence for many years. This changed when the US decided it wanted to use Japan in the colonial power grabbing going on around the world. Japan, seeing its own weakness, rushed to catch up with the Western colonial powers that then ruled the world. A remarkable, painfully difficult process that's seemingly driven by desperation and determination. So, suffice it to say that in post-war Japan, some of the old stereotypes and artistic styles continued to play a role into the 50s, 60s, and probably beyond, as we still see now, in large part due to the lack of vocal minority population and lack of a big civil rights movement in the country. So, thankfully, the last few decades have seen more and more positive changes in manga and anime. But there's, like, for example, there's now a publisher note at the end of Tezuka Osamu's manga, explaining and apologizing for the late mangaka's old, stylized way of drawing various types of people, as well as pointing out the author's dedication to teaching about compassion and the value of all human life. And while lots of positive changes have been made, we're often still led to wonder the underlying foundation of a lot of the points that I just brought up, one of which I'd like to talk about is colorism.
Right. So before we get into, colorism and how it manifests in not only on like a global scale, but in between those communities as well, you talk a lot about how, like in Japan, there are these roots of sort of racism and lack of representation. So, like, can you tell us about how maybe this kind of transcends into other countries who are also East Asian as well, like maybe in K-pop or C-drama or, in those countries as well?
Yes, I definitely can. So when I'm thinking about this, it automatically makes me think about world history because it's a class I'm taking right now in
Right, yeah.
sophomore year. So we learned a lot about how different dynasties in China affected the peripheral countries of Vietnam, Korea, and especially Japan because they're taking a lot of facets from their culture from not Japanese, Chinese culture at the time.
Mm,
So as we see then, we saw a lot of social hierarchy patterns, especially those among women, and even more among people that weren't native to the dynasty. And I think a lot of that plays into colorism because you're not exactly looking as the like homogenous figure of the dynasty that has been established previously. So honestly, I forgot the question.
No, I thought that was a great answer.
Okay.
Definitely. But you kind of like prefaced what you were gonna say on
Yeah.
colorism worldwide. So let's go into that.
Okay, cool. So colorism is defined as prejudice or discrimination against individuals with a dark skin tone, typically among people of the same ethnic or racial group. So at its root, colorism is and at its root, colorism and the resulting discrimination bias that is a result of colorism has some of its roots in classism in Asia. Unlike the racist ideology that was a direct result of rationalism of slavery by Western European countries, colorism in Asia came from the idea that the lower wage workers had to work in the fields and had darker skin as a result. This line of reasoning, when taken even further, results in anti-black racism. In many countries in Asia, the population idolizes lighter skin tones, resulting in the perpetuation of the stereotype and the further objectification of people with darker skin, including indigenous communities, Southeast Asians, and people of African descent. And aside from this, I'd like to begin talking about colorism in the Black community, if that's okay. For African Americans, bias towards lighter skinned people dates back to slavery. Skin complexion sometimes determined what type of job slaves were assigned, or if post slavery they were worthy of receiving an education. In later decades, universities and fraternities and other institutions were known for using the brown paper bag test. Those with a skin lighter than a brown paper bag were let in or more worthy of acceptance. So at its root, the system operates on the cold logic of white supremacy. Colorism shows up in many stark ways, like the difference in pay rates between darker skinned and lighter skinned men mirrors the differences in pay between whites and blacks. Darker skinned people are given longer prison sentences than their light skinned counterparts, and this discrimination starts young. If you're a dark skinned child, you're 3 times more likely to be suspended from school than your light skinned peers. And when I was researching this, I found a really interesting quote from The Guardian that I'd like to share here.
Do
And
tell.
it says, what makes this all so hard to talk about is the internalized white supremacy. If white people disappeared from the planet tomorrow, colorism would still exist in our communities, and that is maybe the most painful part. White people would rather say it isn't real. So I thought that was really interesting, and I wanted to share that today.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. And then furthermore, colorism widely affects the representations of ourselves, which is the overarching argument in my presentation today. The world is becoming more progressive in providing people of color media, but also in a negative way that only shows one version of Black people, often the lightest, most similar to white facet of our entire race. In modern media today, those with darker skin tones are given less positive attention and can be portrayed as characters with certain stereotypical traits, such as large eyes, big lips, things like that. Most things that resemble the symbol of Jim Crow, which I'll talk about later. And in modern media today, those with darker skin tones are given less positive attention and can be portrayed as characters with certain stereotypical traits. Movies, video games, television shows, ad campaigns, online videos, all these forms of media and more are perpetrators of colorism, whether intentionally or unintentionally. This leads to a point of representation, how it has progressed, shifted, and come to its contemporary state from what it once was.
Right, definitely. There was one point that you made that I found that was particularly interesting, specifically where you talked about how colorism within the Black community is kind of a form of internalized white supremacy and internalized racism. So I know this is a very broad question, but do you see any ways where we can dismantle that? And not only the Black community, but in Asian communities as well. Is there a way where we can teach young kids like just love yourself in a way that's effective?
First thing that this makes me think about with the argument towards younger kids and representation that appeals to them is kind of the toys we play with, like such as dolls was a
Mm,
really big thing when I was growing up
right,
personally.
right, yeah.
My mom, yeah, when I was playing with dolls when I was younger, my mom would always make a point to never buy me dolls that didn't look exactly like me, or she would never let those be the sole thing that I would see because she wanted to see me. She wanted me to see myself as normal, worthy of space, which I was normal, not to see myself as normal, if you know what I mean. But she wanted me to see, yes, it's normal. You deserve to occupy the same space that your white counterparts do, and you will. So I think
Mm,
something that will really appeal to children is media representation, especially in films that appeal to them, like superhero movies, things like that. They're younger. Definitely toys, especially dolls, like action figures, things like that. And another thing that makes me think is kind of the books we read, especially in terms of historical fiction. We definitely need more
mm.
characters that are POC rather than like the white characters in the books. So,
No,
yeah.
yeah, definitely. So I guess part of it stems from the environment that our parents make for us and showing
Yeah.
us that, like,
Definitely the environment our parents foster for us and how we
right.
continue to move within that environment.
Right, definitely. Okay, so you talk about representation of Black history, Black people in history, um, and you touched on a little bit of that. So do you want to expand?
Yes, definitely. So the representation of African Americans in media, whether it be speech, writing, still or moving pictures, has been a major concern in mainstream American culture and a component of media bias in the United States. Stereotypes are ingrained in the fabric of the USA and coincide with the institution of slavery. The expected behaviors of African Americans are fueled by stereotypes maintained by the status quo. So stereotypes about African Americans in the USA are products of the institution of slavery, obviously, as I just said. I don't know why I repeated that. But these deeply held beliefs stem from white racist attitudes that were operationalized during the oppressive and discriminatory actions that idealized how slaves should think and behave. So many white slave owners developed beliefs to rationalize their economic, social, and political denominations and like their rights to own slaves. That's how they rationalize them. And a large example of these stereotypes in media is the development and history of blackface. So the portrayal of blackface, which is when people darken their skin with any material, commonly in the past was used shoe polish, grease paint, or burnt cork, and paint on enlarged lips and other exaggerated features. That is all steeped in centuries of racism. It peaked in popularity during an era in the United States where demands for civil rights by recently emancipated slaves triggered racial hostility. And by distorting the features and culture of African Americans, including their looks, language, dance, deportment, and character, white Americans were able to codify whiteness as its antithesis. So, blackface represented a time where black people couldn't even see themselves in media, and the foolish representations of themselves that they did see were vile and inaccurate. Since then, the times have definitely progressed. However, we still see a large disconnect between wholehearted and unbiased representation of black people in art, television, and other forms of entertainment. A way in which this manifests definitely goes back to colorism. Over history, Black people are still struggling to see themselves in the media, and even so, this doesn't refer to all Black people, as those of a lighter shade rarely find trouble being cast into major roles in film and TV shows. And a lot of those characters that they are being casted as would typically and like canonically belong to darker skinned men and women, just people in general. I don't know why I said men and women. The boss, the gender complex. Anyway, however, darker skin actors, dark skin actors, especially women, have much more difficulty when it comes to being cast in similar roles. Recently, our media has been slowly able to improve in the casting of darker skinned women. Black Panther is an example of a film with a comfortable representation of women that look like me or women that are even darker than I am. The TV show Insecure also tends to accurately represent dark skinned women's. The main actress, I think, in that is Issa Rae. And her experiences, love her.
I love
Experiences,
her.
yeah, her experiences in America while showcasing other dark skinned actors and actresses. And so, yeah, while a lot of improvement has been made, it can most definitely be furthered and should be.
Right. So in here, you're kind of talking about like not only should there be representation, but there also has to be diversity within that representation. Um, and it kind of makes me wonder. I know, we are like trying to push forward with this not idea, but reality that people of color are not a monolith, right? We are
Exactly.
so many different faces and stories. But when we realize that, we also have to know there are, Black people who don't all think the same, either socially or politically. And so the reason why I'm bringing this up is because there are Black conservatives who like to say that, movies or Hollywood shouldn't portray much of Black struggle stories. And, I just want to see what your opinion was on that. Like, when we're talking about diversifying our narratives, does that mean we completely stray away from history, or, we embrace it, or both?
I think a big thing about representation is that it cannot be a single story. It cannot be solely one path that we choose to represent ourselves, because that in itself just pushes a stereotypical agenda. It pushes the
Mm.
idea that there's only one narrative that's worth speaking about and there's only one narrative that exists. So, in talking about our struggle stories, yes, we want to mention those, but we also want to mention our successes. We also want to mention our history, the foundation we've been built off of, and how all of that plays into where we're going and where we are currently. So I feel like we can't really talk about the contemporary without first talking about the foundation that we've built
Right.
upon. If that makes sense.
Definitely. I agree. Another thing I wanted was just to talk about the new movie about the Black Panthers. I think it's called Judas and the Black
Yeah,
Messiah. Have you seen it?
I haven't seen it yet, but it's on my watch list.
It's
I
on
was
your
planning on
watch
watching
list?
it tonight, actually.
Oh my gosh. Okay,
Yeah,
well, tell me how it goes after
definitely.
this. But I watched it and I was like absolutely stunned. I think it it's very beautiful and vulnerable. But I hope you'll enjoy it like
I
I
hope
did.
so. I think I will.
Right. So, as we're digging deeper into this kind of representation, you want to talk more about how, it kind of broadly applies to all minorities or all people of color.
I think so. So, when talking about minority representation, we also have to emphasize its importance and why it matters, and also how it affects those that are being misrepresented. Misrepresented. Excuse me, I misspoke. The people who are being misrepresented. Represent. Why is that so hard to say? Oh my god. Okay, never mind.
It's a tricky word.
Anyway, so the continued cycle.
Okay, let's just start from the top.
Okay, okay. So, when talking about minority representation, I think it's very important that we talk about and emphasize how it affects the people who are being misrepresented, and also how seeing themselves in media also helps them, I guess, if that makes sense. That sounds so stupid. Anyway, the continued cycle of excluding diversity, inclusion, and ignoring misrepresentation in the you see how easy that was to say that time? And ignoring misrepresentation in the entertainment and media industry showcases the importance of having diverse storytellers, actors, directors, and producers involved both on screen and behind the scenes. Representation of any and all minorities in media and pop culture should be of the most importance. While this not only shows those who look like us in positions of power, it reaffirms the fact that we occupy spaces and have just as much of a right to do so as our white counterparts. A quote from the medium I wanted to incorporate here says, "The necessity of having diverse journalists, executives, and producers on screen and behind the cameras is crucial. Society is multidimensional, not monolithic. So the beautiful mosaic of all people should be represented." And then there was another quote I wanted to include from Karis May, who was a photojournalist and correspondent for the White House in 2018, I believe. She says, "Representation matters so that the full story can be told, and so you don't have a one-sided story that isn't a fair representation of a diverse population. The media needs to represent the society that it serves because if people don't see themselves, then it's almost like a lack of care that's communicated to people. There has to be some diverse voices that represent everyone in society that can speak from the voice of those people because there are different issues and different things that are of importance to us. On Capitol Hill, for example, the photographers that shoot here and the newscasters that are shown are disproportionately white males. I think that there needs to be more of an effort to seek out diverse voices and diverse representation with a conscious effort. And in conclusion, people feel validated and a sense of worth by seeing themselves reflected on screen and behind the screen. So the integration of diverse filmmakers, directors, actors, and executives into the entertainment and media industries must increase. In order to eradicate the pattern of excluding diversity, inclusion, and misrepresentation, marginalized groups must gain access to having a voice in shaping the culture that they should be included in.
Wow. Thank you. This was really detailed and informative.
Yeah. I spoke so oddly. I'm sorry.
No. I guess one more question would
Yeah,
be like,
lay it on.
do you see like Black representation, historical accurate representation of, you know, the Black community? Do you see that as a very fundamental form of liberation, of social movement, and mobilization?
I think so, without a doubt. I think when I think about representation and how it has shaped me as a person, and also how it lies as a foundation for future representation of the entire Black and African American community, I really often think about literature and Black authors such as Alice Walker and Zora Neale Hurston, and we read a book by her freshman year, loved it.
Mm,
Their Eyes Were Watching God, definitely a recommendation. When I think about that, I just think about how much it like affirmed me to read books about people like frying in cast iron skillets rather than people eating like butter noodles or something like that. It just made me feel good about myself, you know?
right.
So I don't know. I think it's definitely important, as we all know. And I think it's also crucial. It's a necessity for everyone to see themselves in the media, especially people who are just struggling to find their identity in and of themselves, especially as it relates to race. And I think knowing that someone else like has lived like you, has had parents like you, has lived in homes like you is definitely just something that's so helpful and so crucial to shaping kind of the mold we have in our minds of what a Black woman is, what a Black person should be, how Black people live. It's very
Right.
important that we see that rather than a different version of ourselves, because then we're
Right.
like aspiring towards something that's kind of just so homogenous and it deletes like all of our culture from history. So I think seeing that in history and definitely seeing that in the past kind of builds a foundation for us to continue on. Take a shot every time I say foundation.
No, I agree. And you brought up this really good point. I feel like having accurate representation, having the story told in the way that is right, it also kind of educates people, especially in the Asian American community, where you do see anti-Blackness. Because I feel like a lot of that anti-Blackness, or anti-Black sentiment stems from immigrant parents not really knowing the history behind the Black community, right? Like, if you don't know that, then how are you supposed to respect your peers? And
Hopefully.
I think having that representation is important in like educating other minorities that these people are fighting for the same rights as you are. They're fighting for the same representation and the same voice. Um, so I think that was a really
Already.
awesome segue into, why ACE wants to do this, because I think that we build solidarity by lending platforms and offering our voices and insight and, educating one another about all of the important issues um, that are compounded on young people, that are compounded on society. So
That's a
thank you
good
so
advice.
much. Yeah.
Of course. Thank you for having me.